The weight of accusation, a legacy of witch trials for centuries, innocent lives were crushed under suspicion. Not by monsters in the dark, but by neighbors, judges, kings, priests, and terrified crowds. Across Europe and America, a rumor could become evidence. A dream could become testimony. A frightened child could send an old woman to the gallows. These are the stories of people accused of witchcraft, sorcery, possession, poison, and impossible crimes. Some were hanged. Some were burned. Some were crushed, beheaded, tortured, or erased by the very communities that once knew them. This is not a story about witches. It is a story about fear, power, and the terrible weight of accusation. Bridget Bishop lived in Salem, Massachusetts, in a town already trembling with suspicion. Before the accusation, she was simply a woman in the community, moving through ordinary days, surrounded by neighbors who knew her face and her habit. But in 1692, ordinary life collapsed into terror. She was accused of spectral attacks, the kind of impossible crime that needed no physical proof. People claimed her spirit appeared to them, choking them, hurting them, tormenting them when her body was nowhere near. In the courtroom, fear spoke louder than reason. The evidence was dreams, visions, shaking bodies, and frightened voices. Bridget denied the charges, but denial meant little once the crowd had chosen a shape for its fear. The judges listened, the witnesses cried out, and the verdict came: guilty. She was taken from the court toward the place of execution, watched by those who had once called Salem home alongside her. Then, the rope was placed around her neck. The crowd looked on as Bridget Bishop was hanged, becoming the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials, and the beginning of a deadly chain that would not stop with her. Giles Corey was an old man in Salem, stubborn, difficult, and known to those around him. Before the accusation, he lived as a farmer, a man of the earth, hardened by labor and age. But when the witch panic spread, even age could not protect him. He was accused, and the court demanded that he plead guilty or not guilty. Those were the only words they wanted. Giles refused. He knew that entering a plea would place him fully inside the machinery, and so he stayed silent. That silence enraged them. The punishment was brutal and deliberate. He was laid on the ground. A board was placed across his body. Then stones were stacked on top, one after another, pressing down on his chest. The court still demanded an answer. Giles gave none. The weight grew heavier. His ribs strained, his breathing failed, and his body began to break beneath the pressure. He was not burned. He was not hanged. He was slowly crushed by the legal system itself. According to legend, when they demanded his plea again, his answer was not surrender. It was defiance. More weight. And beneath the stones, Giles Corey died. Rebecca Nurse was not the kind of woman people expected to see accused. She was elderly, respected, and remembered as pious, a grandmother figure in Salem's community. Before the panic, she represented stability, faith, and ordinary family life. But the witch trials did not spare the gentle, the old, or the respected. Once the accusations reached her, her reputation began to collapse under the pressure of fear. She was accused of tormenting others through witchcraft, of causing suffering by invisible means. In court, her age and standing should have protected her, but Salem had entered a world where terror outweighed character. At first, the jury found her not guilty. For one brief moment, reason seemed to return, but the courtroom reacted with outrage and pressure. The judges pushed for reconsideration. The jury went back, and the verdict changed. Guilty. Rebecca Nurse was sentenced to death. She was taken toward the gallows with others, not as a violent criminal, but as an elderly woman condemned by panic. There, she was hanged. Her death became one of the clearest signs that in Salem, innocence, age, and goodness were no defense once accusation had taken hold. Agnes Sampson lived in Scotland, known as a healer and a wise woman, the kind of person villagers might seek out in times of illness or fear. But in 1591, during the North Berwick Witch Trials, suspicion rose all the way to the throne. King James VI believed witches had conspired against him, even trying to raise storms against his ship. Agnes was pulled into that royal nightmare. She was accused of witchcraft, of gathering with others, of working dark forces against the king himself. Then came interrogation and torture. Her head was shaved, her body was searched, thumbscrews crushed her fingers. Pain and exhaustion stripped away resistance. Under torment, she confessed to things that fear wanted to hear. Her supposed confession was brought before King James, who took personal interest in the case. Once power, religion, and terror had joined together, her fate was sealed. Agnes was taken to execution. Summoned, she was garroted first, strangled before the fire, and then her body was burned. Her death was not only punishment, it was a warning, staged in a kingdom where the king himself believed witches threatened his rule. Janet, Lady Glamis, lived in a world of castles, bloodlines, politics, and dangerous royal suspicion. She was not a poor outcast or village healer. She was noble, connected to one of Scotland's powerful families, but that made her more dangerous to enemies, not safer. In 1537, she was accused of witchcraft and treason, charges that struck not only at her life, but at her family name. The accusation came in a climate of royal hostility, and when a king's suspicion turns toward a person, the trial is rarely a search for truth. Janet was accused of using witchcraft against the monarch. Her family was dragged into ruin. Her dignity, status, and identity were stripped away until only the accusation remained. At Edinburgh Castle, she was taken to the place of execution. There was no mercy in rank, no rescue in noble blood. She was burned alive before witnesses, her body consumed by flames, while political power dressed itself as justice. Janet's death stands as a reminder that witchcraft accusations could be used not only against the poor and feared, but against anyone whose existence had become inconvenient to authority. Matocchio de Francesco lived in 15th century Italy, in a world where folk belief, healing, fear, and religion existed side by side. Before her accusation, she was associated with charms, remedies, and the mysterious knowledge often attributed to women on the edges of accepted society. But in 1428, that knowledge became dangerous. She was accused of witchcraft, of flying through the night on demons, of attending dark gatherings, and of using magic to harm others. The charges against her carried the strange imagery that would later become familiar across Europe. Night flights, demonic helpers, secret rituals, and confessions shaped by fear. Under pressure, she confessed. Whether those words came from belief, fear, torture, or the desperate need to end suffering, the court accepted them as truth. Her trial became one of the earliest major European witchcraft cases of its kind. Once condemned, she was led to the place of execution and burned. Matocchio's death came long before the greatest waves of witch hunting, but it showed the pattern forming: accusation, confession, spectacle, and fire. Her case helped shape the nightmare that Europe would later repeat again and again. Petronilla de Meath was a servant in Ireland, caught in a case that began above her station, but ended with her body in the flames. In 1324, accusations of sorcery surrounded Alice Keitler, a wealthy woman accused of using magic, poison, and demonic power. But wealth could run, hide, and negotiate. Servants could not. Petronilla became the one who was seized, questioned, and broken. Before the accusation, she would have lived a life of service, labor, and obedience, but in the trial, she became a vessel for everything the authorities wanted to prove. She was tortured, and under torture, she confessed to witchcraft. The confession gave the court what it needed: dark rituals, demons, magic, a story frightening enough to justify punishment. When Petronilla was sentenced to burn, she was taken out as an example, the powerless body left to carry the guilt of a scandal involving those far above her. Burned alive, she became one of the earliest people executed for witchcraft in Ireland, her death showing how easily the weakest person in the room could become the sacrifice. Aubin Grandier was a priest in Loudun, France, a man of status, intelligence, and enemy. Before the accusation, he was not an obscure figure. He was educated, charismatic, and controversial, a man whose conflicts with powerful people made him vulnerable. Then came the possessions. Nuns in Ladun claimed they were tormented by demons, and the drama grew into a public spectacle. The accusations turned toward Grandier. He was said to have caused the possessions through witchcraft, to have made a pact with dark forces, to have sent demons into the convent. The trial was theatrical, political, and brutal. Grandier denied the charges, but denial could not compete with a story that powerful men wanted to believe. He was tortured. His legs were crushed. Pain was used to force confession, but he refused to give them the full surrender they wanted. Still, the sentence came. He was taken to the stake, surrounded by a crowd hungry for punishment. In 1634, Aubin Grandier was burned alive. His death was not only about witchcraft, it was about reputation, revenge, religion, and the lethal power of accusation when joined to politics. Katharina Henot was a respected woman in Cologne, from a prominent family, known as a postmaster and a person of standing. Before the accusation, she had influence, property, and a public role unusual for many women of her time. But in 1627, during a period of intense witch persecution, her status did not save her. She was accused of witchcraft, blamed for misfortune, sickness, and harm that fearful people wanted explained. Once imprisoned, she faced the machinery of interrogation. Torture followed, again and again, over months. The goal was not truth. The goal was confession. Authorities wanted names, networks, proof of a hidden evil. Katharina resisted, insisting on her innocence, but the system was built to treat resistance as guilt and pain as evidence. Eventually, condemnation came. She was taken from prison to execution. A woman once respected now turned into a public warning. Burned at the stake, Katharina Henot died as so many did, because accusation had become stronger than proof. Her case later became a symbol of injustice, but that recognition came far too late to save her. Johannes Junius was not a powerless man. He was the mayor of Bamberg, a public official, a person with status and responsibility. Before the accusation, he stood within the structure of authority itself. But during the Bamberg witch trials, even authority began devouring its own. Junius was arrested and accused of witchcraft in 1628. In prison, he faced torture so extreme that truth became almost impossible to hold on to. Under pain, he confessed to crimes he had not committed, naming others because the interrogators demanded names. But secretly, he wrote a letter to his daughter. In it, he explained the horror plainly. He was innocent, but the pain had forced him to speak. He begged her to understand that confession did not mean guilt. That letter survived as one of the most devastating records of the witch trials. The court ignored the truth his suffering revealed. Johannes Junius was condemned and burned. His story shows the terrible logic of the hunts. Torture created confessions, confessions created more accusations, and the cycle fed itself with human bodies. Megabian lived in Fulda, Germany, at a time when fear of witches had become deadly and widespread. Before the accusation, she was a wife, a woman in her community, and pregnant. But in 1603, she was accused of witchcraft, of poisoning, and of causing death. The charges against her were shaped by the fears of the time: poisoned wells, dead children, sickness, unexplained loss. In that world, tragedy demanded a culprit, and murder became one. She was arrested and tortured. Her pregnancy did not protect her. Instead, it made the accusations even darker, because authorities claimed the child itself was connected to witchcraft. Under torture, she confessed, as so many did when pain became unbearable. The confession sealed her fate. Marga was condemned to burn. She was taken to execution, carrying not only her own life, but the life of her unborn child. The fire consumed them both. Her death reveals the cruelty of a system that could call itself justice, while destroying a pregnant woman through torture, fear, and superstition. Alice Nutter lived in Lancashire, England, a wealthy widow in a world where independence could easily become suspicious. Before the accusation, she was not poor, not powerless, and not the obvious target people imagine when they think of witch hunt. But during the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612, all tensions, local rivalries, poverty, and fear exploded into accusation. Alice was drawn into claims of a coven, curses, and deaths caused by witchcraft. The image created around her was not the reality of daily life, but the fantasy of a hidden conspiracy. In court, the accused were linked together into a frightening story. Children's testimony, local gossip, and fear carried enormous weight. Alice said little in her defense, and silence, like speech, could be twisted against her. The verdict came: guilty. She was taken with others to be hanged. Alice Nutter's death shows how the witch trials could reach across class lines, turning a woman of property into a symbol of secret evil. Once suspicion marked her, wealth and respect could not pull her back. Catherine Deschays, known as La Voisin, lived in the shadows of 17th century Paris. Before her downfall, she was a fortune teller, midwife, poisoner, and fixer for people who came seeking love, inheritance, revenge, or escape. Her world was not the village superstition of old women and neighbors, but the dangerous underworld of aristocrats, secrets, and scandal. During the affair of the poisons, rumors of murder, black masses, infant sacrifice, and occult rituals spread through the French court. La Voisin became one of the central figures. Accused of supplying poisons and arranging dark ceremonies for powerful clients, she was caught in a case that threatened to expose the elite. Her trial mixed real crime, political panic, religious horror, and sensational accusation. Whether every charge was true or inflated, the authorities made her into the face of corruption and evil. In 1680, Catherine Deschays was taken to execution and burned alive. Her death was both punishment and containment, a way to silence a scandal that reached too close to power. Anna Goldie was a servant in Switzerland, living in the late 18th century, long after many believed the age of witch trials had passed. Before the accusation, she worked in a household, dependent on employers and vulnerable to their word. Then she was accused of harming a child through supernatural means, supposedly causing pins or strange objects to appear and illness to follow. The case was dressed in the language of law, but beneath it lay the old pattern: a powerless woman, a frightened household, and an accusation that transformed ordinary conflict into evil. Anna was arrested, interrogated, and pressured into confession. Even in an age moving toward modern reason, the machinery of persecution still functioned. The authorities avoided openly calling it witchcraft, but everyone understood the shape of the accusation. In 1782, Anna Goldie was beheaded. She became known as one of the last people executed for witchcraft in Europe. Her death proves that the witch trial did not vanish all at once. Its shadow lingered, waiting for one more victim. Alza Young lived in Windsor, Connecticut in the early years of colonial America. Before the accusation, little is known about her ordinary life, and that silence itself is haunting. She was likely a woman known to her neighbors, living in a small community where religion, hardship, illness, and fear pressed closely together. In 1647, she was accused of witchcraft. The details are sparse, but the result is clear. She became the first recorded person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. There was no long famous trial, no surviving dramatic speech, no full record to explain how suspicion grew around her. That absence makes the story colder. A woman's life was taken, and history barely preserved the reasons. She was brought to execution and hanged. Aza Young's death came decades before Salem, showing that the fear was already planted deep in colonial soil. The American witch hunt did not begin with the names everyone remembers. It began with quieter deaths, like hers, where accusation was enough, and the record kept almost nothing. Gilles Garnier lived in France, but his accusation was not simply witchcraft. He was accused of being a werewolf. Before the trial, he was a poor man, reportedly living on the edge of society, struggling in a harsh world. Then children began to die, and fear demanded a monster. Garnier was accused of attacking, killing, and eating children, while transformed into a wolf. The charge blended murder, folklore, hunger, and supernatural terror into one horrifying story. In court, the idea of the werewolf made human violence seem demonic and unnatural. Whether Garnier was a killer, a scapegoat, or a man crushed by myth, the court treated the supernatural explanation as real enough to condemn him. He was found guilty of lycanthropy and murder. The punishment was fire. In 1573, Gilles Garnier was burned. His case reveals another side of the witch hunt world. Not only women accused of spells, but men turned into beasts by rumor, fear, and the need to explain brutality with monsters. In the Valais region, between 1428 and 1407, the witch hunt became something larger than a single trial. Before the panic, these were mountain communities, full of ordinary lives, farmers, families, neighbors, priests, laborers. Then accusations began to spread. People were accused of attending witches' gatherings, flying through the night, causing storms, destroying crops, killing animals, and serving the devil. One confession led to another. Torture made names spill out. Each new name widened the circle of fear. The trials moved from person to person, village to village, until the panic became a system. The accused were interrogated, tortured, condemned, and burned. More than 367 people were executed over the course of the persecution. Imagine the effect on those communities. Empty homes, broken families, neighbors afraid to speak, everyone wondering whose name might be given next. The Valais trials helped define the terrifying image of the witches' Sabbath and mass conspiracy. This was no single execution. It was a landscape of fear, lit again and again by fire. In Trier, Germany, between 1581 and 1593, witch hunting reached devastating scale. Before the terror, Trier and its surrounding villages were communities of farmers, clergy, families, and officials living through hardship, bad weather, failed crops, and religious tension. Misfortune needed an explanation, and witchcraft became the answer. Accusations spread rapidly. People were blamed for storms, hunger, sickness, and death. Under torture, the accused confessed and named others. Then those people were arrested, tortured, and forced to name still more. The circle expanded until no one felt safe. Entire families were destroyed. Children lost parents. Villages were emptied of the people who had held them together. Even respected citizens and officials could be swept into the panic. Over 368 people were executed. The punishment was often burning, public, and terrifying, meant to purify the community while actually tearing it apart. Trier shows what happens when fear becomes administration. Records, trials, sentences, fires, and a society convinced that mass killing is self-defense. Würzburg became one of the most horrific centers of witch persecution in Europe. Between 1626 and 1631, the trials expanded with terrifying force. Before the accusations, Würzburg was a city of families, churchmen, tradespeople, children, nobles, and servants. But the panic did not stay among the poor or the marginal. It climbed every rank. Haunted. Children were accused. Clergy were accused. Nobles were accused. Officials were accused. The idea of a hidden witch conspiracy became so powerful that innocence almost ceased to exist. Interrogation and torture produced confessions, and confessions produced lists of names. Those names fed the fire. The young were not spared. Accounts speak of children as young as 7 being caught in the terror. The executions mounted until the number reached around 900. Behind that number were individual lives, mothers, sons, priests, daughters, neighbors, and entire family lines broken. Würzburg reveals the madness of a system that believed it was cleansing evil while becoming evil itself. The more it killed, the more guilty it believed the world to be. Torseka, Sweden, saw one of the most concentrated horrors of the witch trial era. In 1674 and 1675, fear swept through the region, driven by accusations that witches had taken children to the devil's Sabbath. Before the panic, these were rural communities of families, churches, farms, and daily survival. Then children's testimonies and clerical pressure transformed suspicion into catastrophe. The accused were mostly women, named as witches, and judged in an atmosphere where fear had already decided the truth. Trials moved quickly. Confessions, accusations, and religious certainty carried people toward death. Then came the massacre. In a single day, 71 people were executed. They were beheaded first, then their bodies were burned. Imagine the silence afterward. Families shattered, children motherless, neighbors staring at the places where familiar faces had vanished. Torseka was not just a trial. It was a communal wound, a day when belief became slaughter. Its legacy remains one of the darkest moments in Sweden's history of witch persecution. These stories are separated by countries, centuries, languages, and laws, but they all carry the same terrible shape. An ordinary life becomes suspicious. Suspicion becomes accusation. Accusation becomes evidence. Evidence becomes torture. Torture becomes confession. And confession becomes death. Some were hanged in public squares. Some were burned before crowds. Some were crushed under stones, or beheaded, or erased so completely that only a name remains. The witch trials were not only about belief in magic. They were about power, fear, obedience, and the human need to blame someone when the world feels broken. The accused were not always guilty. Often, they were simply vulnerable. And when the fires died, when the ropes were cut down, when the stones were lifted, one truth remained. The greatest danger was never witchcraft. It was accusation.